be doing today is stenciling on fondant and creating texture and dimension. What you see here is a fully ganached cake. Now what ganache is a blend of chocolate and whipping cream, heavy whipping cream, which sets at a soft consistency. It is not too hard, but it is very firm where it maintains the cake intact, and if you put your fondant over it, you have really nice smooth edges and you have a lot of stability. For Zeoto, when you're working on a cake, I do not work with buttercream. If you're going to use buttercream, I would say freeze it first so that it is stable when you're working with it. But for my demonstration purposes, because I always do ganache my cakes, I will be demonstrating on this cake. I do have a link for those who own Zeoto with a step-by-step tutorial detailed on how to make the ganache and cover the cake in ganache. And for those who are wondering, yes, there is buttercream in the middle of each layer. This is a 6-inch cake, and let's measure, and it's 6 inches tall and 6 inches round. There are two methods that you can use when working with fondant on a cake. You can either roll out your slab of fondant to the length that you need. Make sure you measure your cake all the way around to see how many inches it is. This is 19 inches, so if you're going to work on a flat surface, roll it out to about 22 inches. Then you can put your stencil on it and work with Zeoto. Make sure that it is on something stable, so if you need to turn it around to work with different angles, you're able to do so with ease. For this demonstration, I am going to fully cover my cake with fondant. I have plugged in my Zeoto. I am using this tip, which is short. It comes in your kit. It is pointy, but it is round at the end, and it's just the perfect size to make sure that I don't cut all the way through the other side, which shouldn't happen. With the heat, you don't need to apply a lot of pressure when you're using Zeoto. Just allow it to melt the fondant and let it glide. Make sure to keep your tip clean, because the fondant will accumulate and start to burn, and you'll carry that burning process from one end to the other. So always make sure to keep your tips clean. I have my heat set between 110 to 150 degrees Celsius. Always test your pen on an extra piece of fondant to make sure you have just the right amount of heat. You don't want to overheat and melt the fondant so your design doesn't get defined. Another thing is, if you need to add more heat, gradually increase it. It does not take long for it to heat up. Always make sure to keep a wet cloth near you to keep your tips clean. Another thing that I am going to be using is a stencil. Now you can use any stencil. I like this one because it has large details, so when you're adding dimensions, you have enough space to play with to lift it and make it your own if you like. If you use a stencil that has really small design, it's very hard to get a defined detail. Another thing that I'm going to do is because I use cornstarch to keep it from sticking when I was smoothing it out, I'm going to take a little bit of Everclear. It's a very high grain alcohol. It evaporates very quickly, but I'm going to mist my fondant just to take away all of that cornstarch, and also keep it from drying out so we don't get that elephant skin. So just lightly mist it all the way around. Let it sit for a little bit. I also found that when you're working with Zeoto on the fondant, when it's a little bit of moisture on the outside, your details are much cleaner and it looks so pretty, and it's so easy to manipulate the fondant. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to try my heat pen on a piece of fondant, and you can see how easily it's melting it, and I'm not applying any pressure at all. I'm just allowing my tip to melt the fondant, and I'm gliding it backwards to create that fine line. I also always have the silicone tip on hand just in case I need it to go in and define underneath or pull and push when my fondant is still pliable. After using Zeoto, if you get some little rough edges, you can smooth them out with your silicone tip. Also, when you're doing your design, decide whether or not you want this to curl up or, turn it upside down. Kind of play with it to see how it lays on your cake. So you could determine whether or not you want the design coming downward or upward. So I'm going to kind of see what works here. I kind of like this coming downward a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and apply this. And then just take your needle and place it somewhere where it holds your stencil into place. You can place more than one, just to make sure it doesn't move on you. We are going to be going over all these areas with Zeoto. You can also take your hand and hold it down where you need to once your stencil is set into place. What I'm going to do is start with the stem of the flowers. If you notice, my heat pen is not damaging my stencil. If you leave it sitting on your stencil for a certain amount of time, I'm sure that eventually it will start to melt it or burn it. But for this paste that I'm using, or even if you're using a slower paste, it doesn't hurt the stencil at all. Now, if you work slow, I would suggest starting out with low heat. If you work fast, then adjust your heat to a little bit higher so that the heat pen works its magic on the fondant. Alright, before you remove your stencil, make sure you have all your areas stenciled out because it is hard to realign it. And I think I have, no, I've missed this area here. And over here. I'm going to start doing the leaves. I'm not going to do the flowers because I'm going to add my own with fondant. You can use fondant wafer paper. Another suggestion is you can take royal icing and you can go over your stencil to create a beautiful piping effect. If you don't want to create additional effects with the fondant. And if you don't want to add all these leaves, you don't have to either. I kind of like the smaller leaves because it adds dimension. Some look like they're more up front, some look like they're more in the back. Now I can tell by my stencil, because I did not let my cake sit and have the vodka evaporate, it's kind of sticking to my stencil, which is okay. We'll probably get a little lifting effect on that. So wait till your cake is fully dry before applying the stencil. And then after you take the stencil off and you start working with it, just give it another mist over. Not too much, just a little bit. When I do my leaves, notice I come down one side and down the other. Always end at a point. It's easier than having to go all the way around. I have missed this over here. The stencil I'm working with, I got at Hobby Lobby. The Michaels, Amazon, Joann's, they all have stencils. Again, you don't have to apply deep pressure. The heat melts the fondant and allows you to work with ease. And if you want to add more details once you remove the stencil, you could come back and do so. Okay, let me make sure I have all the areas done. And I do. So now it is time to remove the stencil. Look at how beautiful that looks. If you want to leave it like this again and pipe over it, it's also a beautiful effect. So you can see that. I'm going to turn it slowly so you can see all these beautiful details. So what we're going to do now is we're going to change our tip. Before changing your tip, make sure that you take your pen, you turn it off. This is extremely hot and it will burn you. When you're working with chocolate and you have between 50 to 60 degrees Celsius, it is tolerable to touch and remove and change the tip, but not when you're working with an exorbitant amount of heat. All of this area here does get hot. It is metal. It absorbs the heat. Allow the pen to cool, then remove your tip and add the new one. Okay, what I did is changed out my tip. I'm letting my pen heat, and I also gave it a once over really thin layer of mist with vodka to kind of keep the fondant moist. The next tip I'm working with is in the new tip collection. It is the copper tip. It is a horseshoe shape. It is oval and flat on one side and angled with a point. What I'm going to use is the top portion to dig underneath and lift the fondant as if it were a little shovel. You don't want to dig in too deep. You just want to lift and let the pen glide to kind of pull the fondant out forward and create dimension. And look at your petals and follow them as they go. If some go downward, make sure you're putting the dimension in the side that corresponds with how the leaf is flowing. So I'm going to try and start down here with this one because I know it's going upward. And you don't have to go right with the line. You could come out a little bit and make it larger. And then if you want to smoothen this portion out, just take your silicone tip and roll it in. Now my pen is a little bit hot. Copper tips absorb the heat a little bit hotter than your silver point tip, so I'm going to reduce my heat a little bit because my fondant was bubbling. I don't want it to bubble too much. And what I like about this is that when you're using the heat and it does have that little bubble, once it sets, it is very firm and hard, so you won't lose your details. So I could rub over it and it stays intact, which is great. I love that. And I'm very happy with how that looks. I don't want to add a whole lot of dimension down there. And as I come out, I lift. And you can always come back. And I'm curling this a little bit at the end. I like to give it like a stylized look. And basically what I'm doing is I'm holding my tip with the point going forward in the direction of my leaf, and I'm pulling the fondant gently as it's melting forward to create that dimension right there. Okay, I'm going to smoothen out this part right here. Make sure to keep your tips clean. You will smell the fondant. It starts to smell almost like you're roasting marshmallows. It kind of has a really good scent to it. You don't have to make all the leaves dimensional. You can leave some the way that they are and then just add details to them. You can let it set for a little while and then come back and work with it some more if you like. Sometimes when you continue to work with it, such as I was trying to do here, it just continues to heat it up and melt it more. So you can allow it to set, then come back and give it more definition, more depth, more thickness. Just make sure that you're working with the fondant underneath and you're pulling it up. And it kind of gives it a lift shape. And again, all of this stays firm so you can rub over it and it doesn't lose the detail. Okay. Alright, now I'm going to come and curl this one out a little bit more in the end. And it's just very lightly. Don't need to apply a lot of pressure. Just very lightly. Just allow the heat to melt it. Manipulate it with your tip. Okay, let's see how that one came out. I really like how this is looking. I'm trying to make sure I can work well. Angle the camera so you can see what I'm doing. Need to smoothen this out right here. So I'm just going to work with all the ones that come at a downstroke. I like how that one looks. And I find that when the fondant has that little bit of moisture from the vodka, it makes it much nicer with details because you're not drying it out too much. It does have a little bit of moisture in there. Okay, I like how that looks. You can always come to the top part, smoothen it out a little bit. Okay, now this one's going to come this way. So I'm going to turn my tip now facing toward me. And I'm just going to gently glide it, pulling forward. And manipulating the fondant to come at an angle at the end. And you could take your silicone tip, kind of smoothing out that fondant there. And don't worry about this portion right here, because you could come back with your fine point tip and redefine all of that. I want to bring it out a little bit more at the end so that it has more definition. And again, I'm not starting at the line where the stencil was. I'm a little bit more out of it so that when I push the fondant upward, I don't lose the size of my leaf. I don't want to thin them out. I just want to create dimension. Okay. I'm going to leave this little one because it's so small. I'm just going to give it details in the middle. Let's bring this one forward. Okay. Now, as you're going through the stages of adding dimension and details, you can always leave it like this and then just add elements if you like. It's so pretty as you see it change from one design to the next. And you could combine your designs. You can leave some like this, some with more details, some without, just to give it some variation. You can make the leaf come down on one end like this, then lift it up over here just to give it a different shape. And work it all the way into the stem. And all it takes is just barely touching the fondant, and the heat does the work for you. Okay. And again, you could bring it here and work it into the stem, giving it a dimensional look. The stems aren't all flat, and you can do that here too. You could bring the fondant over into the stem, just kind of manipulate it backwards. You don't want to push it into the leaf, you want to bring the fondant backward into the stem and work it in there like that. And you can continue to do this for all of them or just some of them. I'm going to try and connect these two here. There you go. I like how it looks because it gives it a more realistic look. You can see that. It's almost actually like piping over it, but you're just manipulating the pen to do the work. And I really like how it looks like that, so I may end up doing it on some areas and not in others. So same applies. You want to use the tip and glide forward. When you're going downward, you turn the tip pointing the right to your right and glide it at an angle sideways like this. Let me show you with a piece of fondant. You just kind of allow the tip to pull the fondant forward, such as I'm doing here. And then when you're working at this upward, coming towards the left, again, turn your pen where it's angled going upward. And as you're getting to the end, just lift and remove your pen, and then just start manipulating it. You manipulate the base coming back into the stem. Okay. This is a bigger leaf, so I want to give it a little bit more detail at the end. Okay. Just want to smoothen out the edges here. And I'm happy with how that looks. Alright, I'm going to come back with my thin tip, the one that we use to do the stenciling, and I'm going to show you how to create more details and more depth. Okay, I have changed my tip. I'm back to the one that I first started with that comes in your kit. And what I'm going to do is mist the fondant just like that, just a little bit. I want to keep it moist. It's been sitting out for a little bit, and also when you're working with the heat, kind of dries it out a little bit. So I want to keep it moist so it's easier to work with. What I'm going to do is start adding details in my leaves and just pull outward. And then when you do the other side, let me angle it here, just pull outward with your pen and just let it do its natural thing. I'm going to come back and do some more. I want to kind of get the ends here so it gives it more of a natural look in the end here. And just, you could also take this tip and just kind of define all these little areas and manipulate your fondant even more into the stem. There you go. And even add a little bit more depth underneath. I'm going to bring it and add a little bit more here on the tip. You see, now you start creating even more dimension and giving it a more leafy look. And if you don't want to do this portion of it, you don't have to. Again, it all depends on your design. If you just want it to have that stylized look without the details, that is all up to you. And once I add my details, I go around the edge just to give it that extra definition, and it starts to look even more dimensional. Now if you want to create a little bit of groove here in the middle, just take your tip, your silicone tip, push down just at the edge, just so it gives it that extra touch of depth. And now you see how the leaf starts to look like it's folding upward. Now I'm going to create a little bit more depth right here at the end. So what I'm doing is just manipulating my fondant upward with the tip and coming underneath the leaf. Just to kind of elevate it on one side so that it looks more dimensional. And you just take your silicone tip and kind of smoothen it out. And now you start to see a little crevice in there. And it's just basically playing around with your tip. And now I'm going to come to this side and kind of lift it up a little bit right here and work it into the stem. There you go. Now I'm creating a section right here where it splits the leaf, and now you can see the difference. And that's how you start creating dimensions and elevations with your different tips, is just manipulating the fondant. And this leaf I'm just going to leave without elevating it, so you can see how pretty it looks as well once you start adding all the details. And remember, you don't have to stay within your lines. See how I'm coming down and I'm working, just the fondant is pulling downward out, and it's creating already a little edge there without it being too deep. So it looks very natural and very pretty, and it also gives it some definition. And then I come around the other part and I just meet it at the point, and that's how that one would look. Now again, you don't have to add all these inner details. It's just suggestions of things that you can do with Zeoto when you're working with fondant. You can leave it kind of plain. We'll do this one plain right here. We'll just add soft touches. So you can leave your leaves like that too, half done, half undone. And there you can see how pretty those look as well. If you wanted to add a little touches, just do so and come back and reshape the outside of your leaf. These are really small, so they're hard to work with. But with this fine tip, it makes it really easy. Okay. And we're going to do some more of these, and now we're going to add the additional details. And always pull outward. Never push the fondant inward. If you want it to come forward, make sure you start at the back and work your way forward. If you want your fondant to go backwards, then start here and work your way into the stem. Okay. And again, it crusts, so you can go over it and it doesn't lose its definition whatsoever. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and finish this one up here. Let me get my pen angled at a way where you can see it. And again, if we want to give it that extra definition here at the base, just take your tip and kind of work it into the fondant and make that groove right there at the base. And this one's really small here. And I'm going to go ahead and add a stem because it didn't have one, and I'm going to leave it like that so that it just gives it a different dimension. Might add a little bit of detail down here in the base. So we're going to give this one, since it's large, some great details right here. So I'm going to put in all my details. And don't be afraid to pull your tip all the way to the end, because like I said, it's a little bit crusted, so it won't, you're not going to lose your definition, and you can always come back over here and manipulate it how you want with your tip. So let me get the top part of the leaf. I've got to come upward. And then I'm going to take my silicone tip and I'm going to give it just a little crevice right here. Okay. And we're just going to leave this one the way that it is. I'll probably add more details later, but just so that you could see the difference between the two. And then just come back around the edge just to define it. And that's how it would look if you weren't to add in all those additional dimensions underneath. And I don't hold my tips pointing in, I hold it at a slant. Okay. Okay, so I decided to leave my cake covered with a food safe bag for about 5 or 6 hours to see what happens when we come back to work on it. I went ahead and gave it a mist over with my vodka just to kind of soften up the fondant a little bit in case it got crusted. I didn't get this side, just in case it developed a little bit of crust. I figured it would add a little moisture to it so that we can continue to work with Zeoto. And I did this because sometimes we're working with a cake and if it's large or very detailed, we need to take a little break. So I thought it'd be fun to see what would happen if I did cover it and left it and then came back to work with it. Alright, so we're going to continue on adding details. I lost a little bit of the edge here, but it's okay. You can just continue to work with your heat pen to get it back. And again, I'm just leaving the fondant around with the heat to create the design. As you can see, the fondant is still super duper easy to work with. And again, I'm just adding dimensional details on the edges and where the stem is to kind of get it to all flow in together. There's an area here that I want to smoothen out. I want to add some details here. Kind of get the leaf in a little bit. Okay, I didn't wipe my tip, and if you noticed, it started to burn the fondant. I got some browning here, and that's what happens when the fondant sits on the tip and it starts to burn. You can just come here and redefine your stem. If you wanted your stems to be a little bit larger or wider, just utilize a different tip and go over it to just make it wider if that's what you like to do, and then you could keep some of the stems thinner. And for these smaller leaves, you can literally push out your design and make it larger, and then just give it a little bit of a detailed around one side. Bring it out. You aren't limited to what you can do. You have your outline there, so if you want to make it larger, widen it, that's perfectly fine. Lift it on one side. I just made this one a little bit larger, so I'm going to add my details. And again, if your pen is too hot and over melting your fondant, reduce the heat. And if you find another tip in your kit that works better for what you're doing, you can use those and play, like I said, it's all playing around with your tips. Okay, so I have finished everything, and now I'm going to decorate it and take some pictures. And again, make sure that if you use a stencil, it has a very large design, because the small ones tend to get lost with details. So if you have large and small, then you can play around with it, and then everything will flow in together and look beautiful.